So I'm going to speak a little bit, drawing from my roles both at Push and at the Theatre Centre, because in those roles I've been a part of leading organizations that's sort of just on the fringe of being institutions. They exist in this sort of halcyonic place, somewhere between deep indie and capital I institution. And these organizations, in my experience, have bold visions and clear ideas about what it means to be a leadership organization here and now, that I'm going to do my best to highlight in 8 minutes. Emerging leaders are deeply engaged in their community, both inside and outside of the arts. We're invested in supporting a broad community through advocacy and group effort, even if there's no actual direct benefit to our organization. We do this because we understand our role as part of a broader ecosystem, one that we both sustain and are sustained by. Both the Theatre Centre and the Push Festival, as Gideon mentioned, in the past 2 years have developed unique, thriving artistic hubs, and they're examples of how emerging leaders embrace co-location, co-working, and community-oriented spaces to fulfill their mission. If you haven't visited the Theatre Centre in Toronto to see how they succeeded in welcoming the community into the institution, go see it. If you haven't swung by the Post at 750, which is the Push Festival's new home in Vancouver, that we share with 3 other arts organizations, come on by for a visit. It's a real nice place. Emerging leadership organizations operate in partnership with other artists and arts organizations, not in competition with them. In our partnerships, we keep art and artists at the center of our decision-making, meaning that we see our role as being in service of artistic ideas and creation. We don't partner with others to bolster ourselves or to round out our seasons. I once had a colleague ask me to review a partnership agreement that they'd received from an institution. And in reviewing this agreement, I realized that there was a great deal in it of benefit to the institution, but in fact, very little of benefit to the artist. The artist still had to pay for the space that they were as a renter. They're responsible for all the artistic and production fees. They were incorporated into the theater's seasons, such as it was, which actually amounted to them losing any agency over how the show would be marketed or promoted. And they shared the box office revenue and were required to credit the institution as a co-producer. This is not partnership, as we see it. This is actually exploitation. And though it's a very specific example, it represents a dynamic that's really problematic and all too common. When institutions partner with smaller creative entities, these arrangements too often revolve around the institution and its needs. Emerging leaders work to balance an organization's needs against those of the artists that we partner with. We don't attempt to own or accumulate their work in some way. We look for ways that we can support it. We offer up what resources we have, and though our resources are often significantly restrained, we reject a scarcity mentality. I'm actually not super interested in what you have that I don't have, but I'm really deeply interested in what you have to offer and what I can learn from you and what you have to offer the community. We believe quite genuinely that a high tide raises all boats and that it's our role as institutions, big I, little I, to raise that tide, to lead with generosity instead of ego, and because the more success our contemporaries achieve, the better off we'll all be together. Emerging leaders take an evolutionary view of growth and not a linear one. The problem in seeing success as a linear construct is that up and bigger become the only options, and all of a sudden, you really have something to lose. The appetite for risk is lost, and you spend a lot of resources just feeding the monster. Instead of scanning the horizon for opportunity, institutions trapped in a growth model become on constant alert for threat. This causes their grips to become tighter, their partnerships become more self-serving, and eventually this monster becomes an island in decline because nothing grows forever, nothing keeps rising. The better part of the last decade, the cultural sector has been abuzz with conversations about models, old models, new models, dead models, flawed models. We talk a lot about models, and I'm actually not sure that's the right conversation to be having. I think the conversation we should be having is actually about values, as we've heard from a number of our colleagues today. What are your organizational values? What do you stand for, and how do you operate in the world? What is your mission? Is your mission relevant? How well are you achieving your mission? When growth is measured on a different scale, so much more becomes possible. Measuring success instead by how well you're delivering your mission provides freedom. freedom to take risks, to be bold. If operating a facility has become a drain on your resources, you can actually get rid of it because your mission isn't to run a facility, unless that's your mission, and then you actually have to get really creative. If a production is artistically relevant to you, but your subscribers might not get on board, you can actually just program it, because artistic relevance is never a failure if your mission is to be artistically relevant. These suggestions seem flippant to some of you, I'm sure. They seem not to consider some very real considerations, but I'm like 4 minutes deep into an 8-minute presentation, and I'm trying to make a point. They may be simple examples, but they're also a radically different frame to place around the very real decline of major institutions in our country, and it's time to embrace radical change, because it's coming either way. By viewing growth as an evolution rather than an accumulation, emerging leaders create the context for their own success, and in doing so, they keep their organizations vital, adaptive, relevant, and exciting. Our major institutions operate with clear hierarchies. The larger they all are, the taller the pyramid, and this version of leadership is predicated on traditional linear notions of success. It encourages top-down thinking, and it feeds this mythology that the success of our institutions is the result of the great men at their helm. It takes community and opportunity to achieve success. And when we, as institutions, big and small, fail to recognize that, we do a poor job of providing either to young, diverse leaders. Emerging leaders gauge their success by how effectively they empower those around them. They embrace transparent decision-making, engaging staff and board in the decision-making process, especially difficult decisions. Decentralized leadership recognizes that good ideas can come from anywhere, and it's important to create an avenue for those ideas to flow. At Push, one of our greatest assets is our team, who I think are watching at home now. And nurturing that team, keeping it healthy and supported, is one of our core values, certainly the most important part of my job as I see it. In 2012, Google did a study on hundreds of Google teams to figure out what made some of their teams successful while others faltered. The initiative, Project Aristotle, codename, accumulated a lot of data because Google, and what the study ultimately discovered were 2 key identifiers that would actually predict whether a team would become successful, and they're infuriatingly simple. I'm going to share them with you right now. Number 1 is conversational turn-taking. So, meaning not only was everyone given an equal chance to speak, but by the end of a given meeting or a given task, everyone had actually spoken relatively the same amount. There were no outliers. Think about your last staff meeting, and did this apply to it? As a leader, how often are you stepping back and leaving room for others to lead and to offer ideas? Equal access and equal representation are not the same thing. Pro tip number 2, team members displayed a high degree of social sensitivity. So they were skilled at intuiting how others felt based on nonverbal cues, and they responded in kind. So after hundreds of hours of crunching data, Lord knows how much money, Google's crack team cracked the code of strong, dynamic, successful teams, which is that they listen to each other and they care about each other. We may not be able to afford in-house cafeterias and bouncy castle meeting rooms, but even the arts can afford successful teams. When you smash the pyramid, you create room for good ideas to flow, and you keep your team engaged, empowered, and focused on a relevant and bold mission. And that's what successful leadership looks like today. Thank you.